Welcome to the Babylonian Podcast. I'm Michael Light, and I'm a Second Temple Jewish literature junkie and a big-time Bible nerd. And on this podcast, I provide the perspective of Jews that lived just before Jesus, from texts that we have like the apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, and more. With scholars, sages, and scriptures, let's Bible on. In this episode of the Babylonian, we will be looking at the third and final addition to the Septuagintal version of Daniel. Again, this is an apocrypha, so to get the understanding of what an apocrypha is, all you have to do is listen to the first episode of this season. And since this is the third of three additions to the Septuagintal version of Daniel, the apocryphal version, I would also highly suggest that you listen to the previous two, and especially the one just before this, because as we will see as we dive into this one, just like the other one, presents Daniel not as an apocalyptic prophet per se, where he's shown all these miraculous supernatural things in dreams and visions, and where the odd and bizarre take place, and angels come, and there are mystic hybrid beasts that arise from the sea. But rather, Daniel uses wisdom and understanding, like a type of detective, to expose the lies of idols and to slay dragons. And interestingly enough, there is a sort of cameo for another prophet in this apocryphon. So, remember, we find all that in the earlier edition 2, which is Susanna, which is sometimes used to introduce Daniel altogether, depending on which Septuagintal version of Daniel you have, whether that's the original or Theodoton's. And remember, you can always listen to the previous podcast episode to learn more about that. But this addition to Daniel is called Bel and the Dragon. And really, it's two different stories that kind of reflect each other. Now, in the first story, there's this king Astyages, who's laid to rest with his ancestors, and Cyrus the Persian succeeds him to his kingdom. And Daniel is already seen as a companion of the king and one of his most honored friends. And it says that these Babylonians make an idol, who they feed an insane amount of food to, 12 bushels of choice flour and 40 sheep and 6 measures of wine. And this idol is named Bel, Bel being an epithet for the name Marduk. And so the king worships it, and the king asks Daniel, "Why do you not worship Bel?" And Daniel says, "Well, I don't revere idols that are made with hands, but only the living God." And so the king says, "Well, do you not think that Bel is a living God? Don't you see how much he eats and drinks every single day?" And Daniel laughs at him, and he says, "Don't be deceived, king, for this is only a clay and bronze idol, and it cannot eat or drink." Now, you should be recalling here, as always, Isaiah 40 and 46, where it talks about how idols are just bronze or clay, or they're just physical materials that can't do anything on their own. It's the same mockery that Daniel gives. The king is angry, and he calls all the priests of Bel, and he says to them, "If you do not tell me who's eating the provisions, then you will die. But on the other hand, Daniel, you shall die if I can prove that Bel is eating something," for blaspheming against Bel. And so Daniel agrees, and it notes that there are 70 priests of Bel, and they have wives and children. And so the king and Daniel go to the temple of Bel, and the priests of Bel say, "See, we are now going outside. You yourself, O king, set out the food and prepare the wine and shut the door and seal it with your signet." So they do so. But at the same time, Daniel orders his servants to bring ashes and to scatter them throughout the whole temple in the presence of the king alone. So only the king sees that Daniel's putting these ashes out. And then they leave. And during the night, the priests come as usual through a secret trap door that they have. And they come out and they eat everything that was in the place for the idol. And then they go back through the trap door so that they don't break the signet ring. And then early the next morning, the king brings Daniel and he says, "See, look, the seal is unbroken." So they go in and they see that the table is empty. And the king says, "You are great, O Bel, and in you there is no deceit at all." And Daniel laughs at the king and he says, "Look at the floor and notice that there are footprints for men, footprints for women, and footprints for children." And the king is angry. He's so furious that he has all of the priests and wives and their children arrested. And they show him the secret doors that they come through. And so the king puts them to death. And once again, Daniel, the detective, proves to the king that Bel, just as all idols, are fake and can do nothing. And then there is a second story. And these stories could be told on their own, but they do have their own connections and reflections of one another. And in this one, there is a dragon that the Babylonians honor and worship. Now, the word dragon could also be translated as serpent, and I believe some translations reflect that. However, the annotator for the Oxford Annotated Apocrypha, Amy C. Merrill Willis, notes on that verse that, let me find it. They note that it's synonymous with serpent and can also refer to watery monsters such as the Leviathan. And although serpents could be used as symbols of divine power in the ancient Near East, there is no independent evidence that the Babylonians worshipped live snakes. So they conclude that it was probably a dragon, and so they translate it thus. And the king says to Daniel, "You can't deny that this is a living God, so you should worship him." And Daniel says, "No, I only worship the one true living God. Give me permission, and I will defeat this dragon without a sword." And the king gives him permission. And Daniel takes pitch, fat, hair, boils them together, and makes cakes. And he feeds them to the dragon. And when the dragon eats them, it explodes. And Daniel says, "See, I proved to you that it's fake." Now, how the pitch, fat, and hair boiled together would explode anything is, even the annotator on this text says she's lost at how that would happen. But it happens in the text. And so the Babylonians hear about this, and they conspire against the king, and they say, "Oh, he's become a Jew, and he's destroyed Bel and killed the dragon and slaughtered the priests." So they tell the king to hand Daniel over to him, or they will kill him. And so the king sees that he has no other option, so he gives Daniel over, and they throw him into the lion's den for 6 days. And these lions, it notes, have been fed 2 human bodies and 2 sheep every single day. But then they are given nothing, so that they will devour Daniel. And the interesting thing about this is that in the original lion's den, which I believe is Daniel chapter 6, it talks about, at least at the end of it, how God had sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions so that they wouldn't eat Daniel. But it doesn't even pose the problem of these lions being unfed. Of course, you could assume that because the punishment is that Daniel is being thrown in there. Why would they throw anything in there to feed these lions if the whole punishment is for Daniel to be devoured by them? However, this version, which you can see is obviously riffing off of Daniel's account of the lion's den, is seeming to assume, actually, it doesn't really provide any relief from the lions devouring Daniel. There's no reason explained as to why they don't do that. However, it does explain how Daniel is fed. which is interesting that that's the first problem they think of when it comes to Daniel being in the lion's den. But nonetheless, it says that there's a prophet Habakkuk who's in Judea, and he has stew and some broken bread in a bowl, and he's going to the field to take it to reapers. And the angel of the Lord comes to Habakkuk and tells him to take the food to Babylon to Daniel in the lion's den. And Habakkuk says, "Sir, I've never seen Babylon, and I know nothing about the den." And so the angel of the Lord takes him by the crown of his head and carries him by his hair with the speed of the wind. And he puts him down in Babylon right over the den. Then Habakkuk shouts, "Daniel, Daniel," and he gives him the food. And Daniel sees that God has remembered him. And so Daniel gets up and eats and drinks, and the angel of the Lord takes Habakkuk immediately back to his own place. And then on the seventh day, the king comes to mourn for Daniel. And when he comes to the den, he looks in and he sees that Daniel's there. And he says, he blesses the Lord Most High. He pulls Daniel out and throws into the den those that had tried to destroy Daniel. And so that's the end of the story. And you can see how both of these stories are very similar. In them, there is a false god that Daniel proves is wrong. In the first one, you can see how it applies more to Jews in general throughout even the biblical times when the prophets were making arguments for how idols are lies. In the second one, there's a little bit of confusion as to how that might apply. But either way, Daniel uses his detective abilities and wisdom to prove how these idols are fake. And there's a courtroom tale. In the first one, the king challenges Daniel. And in the second one, Daniel challenges the king. And then after that, the king is forced to throw Daniel into a lion's den, which is a sort of test that Daniel miraculously passes. Not based on what he can do, but it's sort of a test that shows the power of God to use this Habakkuk cameo to feed for Daniel and save him from the lions. And so you can see the connections in the texts. Further, in the first story, the king had threatened to put the priests to death if they didn't prove that Bel was eating anything. But in the second story, the priests are the ones who have the power, and they threaten to put the king to death if he does not put Daniel into the lion's den. So either way, this is just a short story. It's about 42 verses long. Again, it's all one chapter. And so you could read it in maybe like less than 10 minutes for sure. And it's a little bit interesting, a detective story that is surely similar to Susanna. And in fact, it's in different places of the Septuagint Bible based on which version again. There are two Septuagintal versions of Daniel. Theodoton's version has it in chapter 13. And then in the OG version, it's following Susanna in chapter 14. And in fact, this annotator says that this seems to have been an entirely independent type of text and oral tradition that was later incorporated, added to the other Daniel stories found in the Septuagint, and that Theodoton's version may indicate that the original reflected an older independent tradition that existed even before the Hebrew Aramaic text of Daniel became something authoritative, not necessarily written. So, and they talk about this, the references, it could be inserted into the Persian king of Cyrus in place of the king of Babylon in the Theodoton version in order to integrate the story into the larger collection of the Daniel stories. And she goes on to say that the similarities between it and Daniel 3 and 6 may indicate that it was composed in the Persian period between 539 and 333, when court tales were enjoyed wide popularity throughout the Persian Empire. And then they also say that Daniel's destruction of the Temple of Bel may also hint at the historical destruction of the Temple of Bel by Persian king Xerxes I, who ruled from 486 through 465. And then, if so, the story could not be earlier than Xerxes' reign. So, if this is true, then this could prove an earlier dating than the Hasmonean period for Daniel, which, if you don't know what the Hasmonean period, we will be discussing that, which is probably one of the most important intertestamental, quote-unquote, events, actually by far, not really a question, and we'll be getting into that in the next episode. But there's a lot in Daniel that could be seen as being written in the Hasmonean period, because there's just direct parallels, one for one, in Daniel chapter 11. And the Hasmoneans, also known as the Maccabees, are a very important and powerful family that have many texts written on them, the first of which we will be, again, discussing next week in Babylonia. Hope to see you there.